This episode of the LabVIEW Experiment podcast is brought to you by Zaya Solutions.
The LabVIEW community is too small for open source projects to make enough money to live just with the contribution of developers.
Welcome to the LabVIEW Experiment. I am your host, Sam Taggart from SAS Workshops. In my 15 years of working with and training developers, I've had the opportunity to conduct a lot of experiments. Over here, we believe in embracing failure as the essential learning experience that it is. And what better way to learn than from other people's mistakes? In this podcast, I talk to industry experts, colleagues, and friends about their failures and how they have turned them into future successes. I am here today with Olivier Jourdan of Wovalab, and known Olivier for several years. He's one of the DQMH trusted advisors, and now he's part of the DQMH Consortium. And so I'm sure we'll get to talk about that in a little bit. But one of the reasons I wanted to have Olivier on is because he is the author of one of my favorite LabVIEW add-ons or toolkits, and that is Antidoc, which I think is just amazing, and I love it, and I use it all the time. And so I was hoping we could start by just having you explain what it is and what you use it for. And then maybe I could chime in with some of my experience, and then we can just kind of go from there and see where the conversation goes.
Okay, Sam. First of all, thanks for having me, and I'm glad to hear that Antidoc is your favorite, one of your favorite add-ons to LabVIEW. Basically, Antidoc is here to prevent you from writing your documentation and the documentation of your source code.
Can I stop you real quick? When you say documentation, is it explain for everybody else, because I know, but explain for everybody else. Is it documentation in the terms of like the end user would see, like the user of your software, or is it documentation for other developers?
It's documentation for the developers. Basically, the tool is parsing your LabVIEW project and tries to get the most of this parsing. One thing I really tried to do with Antidoc is showing things you cannot see easily with LabVIEW. For example, if you are using DQMH framework in your project, you are going to see diagrams that shows relationship between the modules, that show which request is used, which broadcast is listened by which module, etc. And this is something really difficult to get that big picture looking at your code. So Antidoc is adding value to what you can get with LabVIEW. At the end, you can get a PDF or HTML file, something really professional, I would say. You can automate this creation of the documentation. I'm using Antidoc in every project with CI. So when I'm releasing a project, my customer know that he's going to have the documentation of the project, and the documentation is going to be up to date. And you have a direct link to the documentation and the commit done for the release. And this is something that is going to help you if you are starting a project again and you have this documentation. You are going to understand the communication between the modules. If you need to onboard a new developer in your project development, you can tell him, you are going to work on this module. Look, this module is related to these 3 other modules. I want you to use this to implement this new request or to listen this broadcast from this module. And you can start diving into your application through the documentation, because you know that this is up to date, and you know that this is something difficult to see in your LabVIEW environment.
So I find it very interesting that you just described what Antidoc is, and it's 100% like that is what it is. But you didn't mention my 2 favorite use cases, actually. So one use case is legacy code, like you inherit somebody else's project and there's no documentation. Running Antidoc is a very easy way to get lots of information, like you said, that's not immediately obvious. And so to get all those dependencies. And then I actually use it as a development tool. So like as I'm developing in my CI, I'm constantly regenerating the diagrams that show all the dependencies. And so, I'll inherit a project and it'll have weird dependencies. I'll be like, okay, well, I want to change these dependencies. So I'll break them like one arrow at a time. And then I'll write the code to break the arrow, and then I'll run it and make sure that the arrow is broken and that things are going the right way. And then I'll go and break another one. And I can watch the graph like change in real time as I'm developing, which I think is really a cool part of the tool.
One use case of Antidoc, and I'm going to give a tip for the company that would like to apply to the Trusted Advisor program, for example. You know that because you are also a Trusted Advisor, but there is a process, and part of this process is making a code review of one of your DQMH code.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing we do when we review a DQMH code provided from a company that want to apply to the Trusted Advisor program is to run Antidoc and to look into the documentation. And you can see if people are using DQMH the right way, or at least know the basics of DQMH. Just an example, and it's not 100% sure, but once I generated the documentation and I didn't see any broadcasts.
Oh.
And there was, I think, 10 modules, no broadcast. So the first thing that came in my mind is there is a bug in Antidoc. I'm missing something. Antidoc is missing something. Then I opened the code and we saw that broadcast wasn't used. And so we dive into this and we understand that one understanding of the DQMH framework wasn't totally the mind of the developer who developed the code. So it was interesting to look in the code after seeing Antidoc documentation.
I think that's definitely it's an advanced skill. I feel like beginning LabVIEW developers and beginning programmers don't understand dependencies as well as they should. And I feel like that's really what separates really good code from just like okay or mediocre code is that being able to separate all the dependencies.
Yeah, and the graphs are really something that add lots of value to Antidoc. And I must take the opportunity here to thank Cyril Gambini that helped me on this part of Antidoc. Its toolkit helps to draw the diagrams. Yeah, you're right. Dependencies between the modules are clear with those diagrams. Yeah, you can find weird dependencies just looking at the diagrams and fix bugs. And you're right, beginners probably didn't get all the thing related to using this request or creating this broadcast and listening this, etc.
Yeah.
And
yeah, there was an interesting post on the forums, not to pick on whoever it was that posted it, but there was somebody posted they were having problems with their DQMH code, and then they posted an Antidoc graph of it, and it was gigantic. But the big thing I noticed immediately was just from looking at the graphs, you could immediately pick out the circular dependencies. And that's just like an immediate like red flag. But as you mentioned, some of those things are hard to see without the graph because they're like, A depends on B, which depends on C, which depends on A. And if it's A and B depend on each other, sometimes that's easy to find. But those indirect circular dependencies are really hard to find.
Yeah, and
it has a lot of problems. Sorry.
Yeah, and if you have a large application, I have one large application where I think I have 50 modules. it's just impossible to draw this graph manually. And with Antidoc, it's 20 minutes, but it's the CI, and you get something that try to have all the dependencies. We could miss some. I don't have any cases. I know that I fixed bugs in the past where we were missing some dependencies.
Graphs that they don't actually directly show dependencies, right? Because they just show the messages. So like if you used a type def from one module and another, you could still be dependent on it, right? Without that.
That's a really good point. And that's something I'd like to add to Antidoc. I don't know if it's really part of the source code documentation, but this is something I would be really happy to have a document that draws LabVIEW dependencies and not messages to DQMH. And the thing is, I would like to be able to point that type definition you use in a cluster you didn't remember, and that can cause
Lots of ripple effects.
yes, and this is something much more difficult than looking for dependencies between modules.
I just had an idea for Antidoc that might be useful, and it might not take a whole lot to implement. If Antidoc would just create a blank project and load each module in a blank project and just show all the dependencies that are not in VI-lib and just take a snapshot of that. Just a simple screenshot of that, I think that would be quite useful because that's easy enough to do manually, but if you have a bunch of modules, it's really hard to do that.
From my experience, hunting dependencies in large projects, if you have really dependent libraries and classes, you are going to end up with each library you want to load in a project, loading every, or
that's the problem.
80%. So you need to know what part of the code is causing these dependencies.
Yeah, so it's not enough to know that they're dependent. You need to know why, so you can break it.
You know that you have dependencies because your build is going to be really slow. When you load your project, it's slow. You have some crashes. You know that you have dependencies issues, but finding what is the root cause of the dependencies, it's much more difficult. And having an automated tool that will do that would be great. But Antidoc is open source, so
there you go. That's
one. If one of your listener want to help introduce this feature in Antidoc, he is welcome, or she is welcome.
Yeah, dependencies are definitely a problem. I remember I had an actor framework project that was like taking forever to build, and I couldn't figure out why. And Steve asked me a question, Steve Watts. He's like, well, do you use type defs? And I was like, yeah. He's like, there's your problem. I was like, oh, crap. And it was like configuration type defs or something, but they were getting passed around from one actor to another to the nested actors, and all of a sudden now everything was dependent on everything else, and it was just... I basically just created a folder on disk, and I drug everything out of all the other libraries and dropped all the type defs in one folder, and all of a sudden it all went away, and I was like, huh. So yeah, I'm very cautious anymore about, like, type defs totally make sense inside a module, but when you cross boundaries from one module to another, you have to be very, very careful and thoughtful about using type defs.
One error I made in the past was to have a library containing all the classes I was thinking those classes was used everywhere. So I find it useful to put them in a shared library, something comes up. And it was the big mistake I made in this project, because each time I was loading one of the classes, it was loading everything.
So that's really funny. I just had a conversation yesterday with somebody in our mastermind group, and they were talking about how, like, they thought it was a code spell to create VIs and stuff that did not belong to a class or a library. And I would say in general, I agree with that, but this type def thing is definitely one spot where it's useful to not have them in libraries, because then you can use them and not drag everything else in with them.
Yeah. Totally agree.
Yeah. So let's change subjects slightly. Antidoc is based on something called ASCIIDoc. Right? So can you tell us a little bit about that and how that works? And
this is something people that are interested in Antidoc can mix in their mind. So Antidoc is the tool that parses the LabVIEW project, and we need to generate a document at the end. And one thing I wanted when I start this project was to spend less time possible on the generation, the PDF generation, the HTML generation. This is not something I want to spend time. I want to spend time on how to find the right information. So I look into what was existing, and I had the opportunity during a European summit to attend to a presentation from Tatiana Boe about docs as code, about Markdown, all this lightweight markup language. And this is something, it was now 5 or 6 years ago, well, 4, 5, 6, before COVID, before the pandemic. And this is something I thought there is something to do there. And when I started working on Antidoc, I chose to use ASCIIDoc as the raw file generated by Antidoc. And ASCIIDoc is a lightweight markup language. Like you can have Markdown. This is something well known now, because when you are using GitLab, GitHub, you are formatting your message in the comments, etc. You can use Markdown. ASCIIDoc is not that easy to use than Markdown, but it allows you much more. You have processor that can generate the PDF and the HTML and any kind of readable file format at the end, starting from this plain text file. You can include other files in your main ASCIIDoc file, and you can generate professional-looking documents with ASCIIDoc. So Antidoc is using another project I'm working on called ASCIIDoc for LabVIEW. And with this project, and I take the opportunity of this discussion to thank you for contributing to this project on the unit test part. With this small toolkit, you can generate ASCIIDoc syntax in your LabVIEW program. And since the last version, now you have all the toolchain that allow you to have this plain text file that is not something you can share with others or put on the web. And you can take this file and generate the PDF or the HTML file starting from this plain text file. So now you have all the toolchain from LabVIEW to PDF or HTML with this toolkit.
Cool. So before we move on to another related topic, I have a question. That the unit tests that we wrote, are they still being used? Is that still useful? Have they aged well?
Yes, they are still run when I push something on the project. I have to say that it's not that easy to maintain, because I'm mostly to be fair, I'm not used to do unit tests. This is not something. This is something I need to improve in my LabVIEW development process. But they are still useful to check that I didn't break something when I implement a new feature.
Cool. They might be a little too low level, though that might be part of the problem because they are very low level.
Yeah, but you need to check the syntax. So I think it's a low level thing.
Okay.
It's mostly because I'm not used to do that.
I was just going to point out, I recently wrote this new library called Approval Testing for LabVIEW that you might look at. I'll send it to you afterwards and you can take a look. But basically, it takes a string, and then every time you run the test, it looks at what the last, the approved version of the string is, and it compares it. And so you could like generate like a small document and just say, this document should always generate the same way. And then if I change something, then yeah. So that might be a little bit better. Maybe not, but just a thought.
Yeah, that's something interesting. And my guess, and for this toolkit, it's all about string. So
yeah, exactly. So that was part of the thought of it.
It's the best use case.
Yeah. So you could just like create a bunch of elements and then dump the string into this testing thing, and then every time you run the test, it looks at it and it says, did it change? And if it did, it fails. And if it stays the same, then yeah. So that's kind of cool. Are you looking to accelerate your projects while ensuring future flexibility? Zaya Solutions' team of LabVIEW architects can help you realize your goals, from initial R&D prototyping through full-scale mission-critical deployments. With their extensive experience in test, automation, and systems integration, whether it's an actor framework program or a real-time distributed system, they'll get you up and running faster than ever. Learn more and check out their innovative open-source utilities for the LabVIEW community at ZayaSolutions.com. That is ZYAH Solutions.com. Let's see. I did want to talk about some expansions on Antidoc, right? Because originally it was mostly DQMH, but you've expanded it to work with Actor Framework and object-oriented designs and some other stuff as well.
So, as you said, it was at the beginning oriented to DQMH because it's the framework I'm using every day. So I did it for myself at the beginning. But we are also, I'm saying we because I see Antidoc as an open source project, and I like to think that there is a team behind Antidoc. Antidoc is also documenting the libraries, so just the description of the libraries and the functions in the library, the classes, and we have the class diagram of all the classes and one section for each classes where you can see the direct inheritance if there is inheritance. It's also supporting the interface. And the last improvement I made on Antidoc was to implement JK state machine parser. So you can see the different states and the link between the states. And that's all for now. I look into Actor Framework. I had some conversation with developers that are using Actor Framework, telling me that we want to help you. It never so far it never finishes with something real. But I look into Actor Framework, and one thing I'm concerned about it and about how to parse the project is that Actor Framework are related to objects. So when you want to launch an actor, you use the same function and you use the object you want to run. And this is something really difficult to parse because the object can come from everywhere. It's not as static than the DQMH. DQMH, you have, for each module, you have one VI that starts one module. So it's really easy to find the start module VI. With Actor Framework, I think it's going to be much more difficult to draw what we are drawing with DQMH. But I'm not a specialist of this framework, so I need help from Actor Framework developer. And time is missing. I need to make choices in the feature I want to implement, and something difficult. Antidoc became a really large project. I think I spent about 400 hours this last 3 years on this project. It started to be a large project, and I need to make some money for myself with Wovalab. And sometimes it's difficult to invest more, and I need to choose the feature I can implement more easily.
So you mentioned getting paid to do work. Have you had any luck? I know you have a Patreon account. Has that generated much income, or?
You are the first one to contribute to all the open source project Wovalab is maintaining and developing. So thank you for that. JKI also is contributing, but so far you are just 2 companies that are helping me to change the priority, I would say, because this is something. This is a big issue, I think, for open source and the LabVIEW community. If we have time to discuss that, just stop me when you want.
No, I think it's a great question to have.
I think that the LabVIEW community is too small for open source projects to make enough money to live just with the contribution of developers. And LabVIEW is used in lots of companies, and I think the companies need to understand that if they want to use open source projects that help them to get their projects done faster, or help them to have documentation the customer wants, etc., etc. There are a bunch of great open source projects, and I feel that there are more and more open source projects in our LabVIEW community. But if we want a large project to be maintained and develop on a long time period, the company needs to help sponsor this kind of projects. I see 2 advantages to do that as a company. You are helping the developer to maintain the projects you are using for your business. That's the first advantage. And you can get some sponsoring marketing effect that we are helping these projects to be maintained. So that's the advantages. And there is a drawback to not supporting this project. If you find a bug, or if there is an issue, or if the new version of LabVIEW is not compatible with the tool you are using for your project, if the developer is not here or not available or don't want to work on it, you are going to be, even if it's an open source project, you can access the code, but I can say that it's not that easy to dive into an open source project. And the bigger the project is, the more difficult finding issues in this project it's going to be.
Well, Yeah, I think there's also another advantage to supporting open source code by donating to and stuff, and that is you can get your features can get priority as well. Because I support the SQLite browser project, and I put in a comment about like I was having issues with something, and like they fixed it the next day. I was like, oh, okay, like great. Yeah,
I agree. I agree. When an issue came from a donator or a contributor, you are probably more inclined to see what's it's not working and try to fix this because if it's just, hey, it's not working, can you help? I don't have the time. Yeah, you're right. It's helping, I think.
well, I also think there's potentially another model. I know DQMH is not exactly open source, but I know Fab was selling, even though DQMH was free, she was selling DQMH support licenses, right? Which would guarantee that you'd have somebody there to answer your questions and help you debug things. And
Yes, but it's still, as you said, it's different. DQMH is not open source. If I try to do the same with my open source project and selling support, I'm going to sell support. If I sell support, I'm not working on new feature.
yeah, and you have
People, and it's no, I'm supporting you to use the tool. I don't have time to add new feature. This is something, contribution, sponsoring is something fastest way to have things being done faster. And Wovalab is donating and sponsoring the ASCIIDoc project because it makes sense for me. I based my open source project on ASCIIDoc and ASCIIDoctor. If this project dies, my tool is dying. Yeah, you can make business around your open source project, I think. But if you have your own business and you are creating open source project, maintaining open source project, you don't need more business. You need a way to prioritize this open source project over your paying customer. You need to have a customer as your open source project, and the customer are the contributors. And I think, and you know that we are the hourly rate of an experienced developer. It's not, it's a bunch of dollars or euros. So yeah, $5, $15 of contribution every month. It's really good. I'm really happy to have this, but I really think that companies have more capabilities of investment in open source project. And I know that lots of, if you need to develop every open source project you use in your project, it will cost much more than just giving $100 every month to the projects that you are using.
yeah, I have no problem donating to the open source projects that I do because they all save me tons of time and energy.
Yeah, but this thing is difficult to see, or I think people know that, but they don't really want to think more about that and about what what it means. What it means is that probably we should help them. And it's still something win-win. Developing your own tool is really difficult. Open source projects are used by lots of users. Take DQMH. It's not open source, but it's used by lots of people. And we often have this discussion in the consortium. You see that message in the forum? I never thought we can use DQMH for doing this thing. So you know that DQMH is used in a variety of different contexts. So the bugs are fun. And if you are just creating your tool for your own need, you are not going to have something as reliable as a tool used by lots of people.
Yeah, well, I think that goes down to the people who don't want to support it open source, I think they're looking at cost versus value, right? Because once you see the value of what you get out of it, I mean, Antidoc, like, it saves me so much time, like, and I look at how much I charge per hour. I'm like, that saves me 2 hours. Like, and it's easy to find something that saves you an hour or two. That's not hard. There's open source projects all over the place in the LabVIEW community that can easily save you an hour or two.
And speaking of Antidoc, I think if you have a large project, it's saving more than 2 hours.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, that's the same problem that you run into, running your own business, talking to customers and stuff, right? Trying to get them to think more long term and more about the value of what they get. And as you mentioned with the open source stuff too, if you don't pay for it, eventually it will go away. So, if you get any value out of it, it's worth throwing a few dollars at it. So, yeah, I definitely got on my soapbox about that. I have a blog post where I wrote all about that. So people can go read that if they really want to know my thoughts. But you are also part of the DQMH Consortium. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes. For me, it was should be in April. It will be 2 years. The consortium is existing, and I need to thank Fabiola to make this possible now. And DQMH is a tool. When I started my company, I didn't think a lot about which framework I'm going to use. It was DQMH because I tried to use it in my former company. It wasn't possible. And so I started using DQMH. I really loved it. I became trusted advisor. There was this opportunity to be part of the DQMH when Fabs decided to give all the intellectual property of the DQMH to this consortium where we are 5 people and 4 really experienced LabVIEW developer, and it's really interesting to be part of this journey because it's a tool, it's something we know people are using, and we really want to make this better and better, to continue what Fabs started 5 or 6 years ago. And it's a really interesting experience because we have people from different countries, so you have different way to think, and it's really empowering, and we have lots of really interesting discussion on how we want to make DQMH better for each version, how we try to make money to help these new improvements, the development to this improvement, the maintenance of the framework. And it's a new business for me, I would say, even if it's not making any money for Wovalab, because we reinvest every dollars in the DQMH framework. It's really interesting. It's different from an open source project, and we hope that developers that who are using DQMH are happy to use DQMH, and we hope that it helps every LabVIEW developer to make their project a success.
Very nice. So one of the things I know the consortium is trying to do to raise a little bit of money is selling some tools. If you want to talk about some of those.
Yeah. I think that there's no NDA about this tool. One tool is very, very something. I don't know when the podcast is going to be released, but we have a tool. We did the demo of this tool 1 year ago at the GLA Summit. And it's a tool that allows you to see the communication between modules in real time. So Antidoc is showing you everything that is static, so the static link between the modules. But this tool is going to draw sequence diagram in real time. So you are going to launch a viewer, and then you are going to see, oh, this module is sending a request to this other module, and this other module is broadcasting data. And oh, there is a new module created. This module is sending a request and wait for a reply, and you are going to see everything drawn in the viewer. So it's going to be really useful to debug your application, to understand how it works. And it's also something interesting to learn how the DQMH is working. When you learn and when you teach DQMH, you need to teach that you are creating modules. Modules can communicate, but you are not seeing this message. This message is sent from one module to another. And with this tool, you are going to see all the messages sent over the application. And this is a tool we really hope that it's going to help developers, and it will be a paying tool. And we hope that it help us to improve DQMH more and more.
Very cool. And one other thing, you mentioned training, right? So there is some DQMH training out there.
Yes, you and me are teaching DQMH. The consortium has all the material for a 3-day training about DQMH, and all the trusted advisor can teach this course. And I did it twice this year, and it was really interesting. And you can see that people know DQMH, but when you are really diving into the details, etc., they are learning things. And sometimes, you see that, you know that after this training, it's going to be much better for them in their development. I don't know how you feel when you are giving this training.
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of it is the little tips and tricks and the little kind of details that people gloss over. Like you said, with the broadcasts and managing the dependencies. That's kind of my focus when I teach the class, is trying to be very careful about making sure which way messages are going. Because I feel like that's probably the number one thing I see people screwing up when they start out with DQMH. So
You're right. Broadcast, request, it's different thing. It's the same, but it's different.
But Antidoc is actually a great tool, and I use it all the time at the class, and it definitely illustrates the difference, because you can look at the two different diagrams, and it's immediately obvious. So,
and I'm really glad. I think the first time we speak, and you were there, it was in Birmingham at the GDIFCon 2. We discussed about lots of tools around DQMH, and I started really to work on Antidoc during this event. And it really helps. And I'm really glad that when I hear that it helps developers, that's the purpose of this project.
Yeah, that's great. Well, all right, Olivier, we're coming up on our time, so it was very great talking to you. I quite enjoyed it. If people want to go learn more about DQMH, there's the DQMH.org, right? Is that the correct website? Yeah, so you learn about trainings and other tools, and there are even more tools than the one that Olivier mentioned. And if you just search for ASCIIDoc and Antidoc, you can find lots more information about those. Right?
Yeah, you have the GitLab project, you have websites with the documentation. I think if you look at Antidoc in Google, it's going to point out to these resources.
Yeah, you did a very good job. Like, that project's very well managed, and it looks very nice and professional. And because that's a lot of work when you do an open source project, is buttoning it up and making sure the presentation is good. And so
Thank you.
all right, thank you. That's it for today's episode of the LabVIEW Experiment. Thanks for listening. If you have any comments or questions, head over to thelabviewexperiment.com and drop me a note. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at the LV Experiment.